Casser-Jayne Show, talk radio for fine minds, airs Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern, and is always available for your listening pleasure at HalliCasser-Jayne.com. And thank you so much for being here. I am Halli Casser-Jayne. Today on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, joining me at my table are two award-winning writers of historical fiction, author of The Winter Guest, Pam Jenoff, and the author of Sleep in Peace Tonight, James MacManus. But before we begin, a brief message from our sponsors. You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, talk radio for fine minds. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is always available online at HalliCasser-Jayne.com and a host of venues including blog, talk, radio. But be sure to visit us at our newest home on iHeartRadio. Today, the Halli Casser-Jayne Show is brought to you by Audible.com, a leading provider of spoken audio information and entertainment. Listen to audiobooks whenever and wherever you want. If you want to listen to it, Audible has it. With over 150,000 titles in virtually every genre, you'll find what you're looking for. Get a free audiobook and 30-day trial today by signing up at www.audibletrial.com/The Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Hello, I'm Halli Casser-Jayne, host of The Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Join me Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern when I talk with the great artists, writers, musicians, politicians, and celebrities of our day. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is talk radio for fine minds. Tune in live or listen to the podcast at HalliCasser-Jayne.com. Pam Jenoff did not start out to become a novelist, but aren't we glad she changed careers midstream? The best-selling author of several novels, including the Quill Award nominee The Commandant's Girl and Grand Central Station, Jenoff is a graduate of George Washington University, Cambridge, and Penn Law. Along her journey to her writing career, Jenoff served as the special assistant to the Secretary of the Army, and in 1996, after moving over from the Pentagon to the State Department, she was assigned to the U.S. Consulate in Krakow, Poland. It was during this period that Jenoff formed a close relationship with Poland's surviving Jewish community and developed an expertise in Polish-Jewish relations and the Holocaust. Author, wife, mom, and teacher, Jenoff is out with a new book, The Winter Guest, the story of twin sisters fighting for survival in Nazi-occupied Poland, 1940, struggling to raise their younger siblings when one finds a downed American paratrooper in the woods. Let's talk. So, Pam, I think you can add to your resume of best-selling author, lawyer, wife, mother, teacher, overachiever. I'm researching you and I'm exhausted listening to everything you've done and that you're doing. How do you do it all? You've got young kids, right?
I do. I have, I used to say 3 preschoolers. My oldest is in kindergarten. But my short answer is I do too many things and none of them well. But I'm joking there. You know, right now, in addition to the kids, I'm on the faculty at Rutgers Law School. I teach law school. I write the novels. And I'm reminded of, I'm going to paraphrase Anne Lamott. She said, before children, I couldn't write if there were dirty dishes in the sink. And after children, I could write if there was a corpse in the sink. And it's one of my favorite quotes because I do think it's so true. You just kind of get it done.
Yeah, well, you get it done. And you don't tell me you don't do it all well. You do it all well. Your journey to novelist has certainly been kind of circuitous. I mean, you started out one way, you wind up going through this whole other journey. Well, let's talk about that journey. You're the sum of the parts in my research. That's what tells me. Without a doubt, the part of your life that seems to have influenced everything the most was your time in the State Department when you were assigned to the U.S. Consulate in Krakow, Poland. Talk to me about how that came to be.
So I joined the State Department as a junior first tour diplomat. And I didn't join to work on these exciting issues about the Holocaust and the war. I went to Poland, like so many junior diplomats, to stamp visas and passports and help American citizens who got in trouble over there. But it was this amazing moment in time when Poland had just come out of decades of communism in the mid-1990s. And there were all of these issues from the Second World War that had never been resolved during those intervening years when the conversation was stifled by the communists. So you still had these questions about, anti-Semitism and preservation of concentration camps. And they became very important in the 90s when Poland wanted to join NATO and wanted to join the European Union, and they had to make progress on their issues from the war. So I arrived in Poland, I was in my early 20s, and I was halfway around the world from my family. And you must bear in mind that this is pre-cell phone and pre-internet, so I'm really quite isolated over there. And I gravitated toward the surviving Jewish community in Poland. I'm myself Jewish, and I became very close to the survivors. And the U.S. government, the consulate, seeing that I had this affinity for the community, said, okay, you handle those issues from the war. And so that kind of became my job.
Did you have any connection to Poland prior to this assignment, or any understanding of all of this other than the way most of us might?
I did not. My family's all nominally from Eastern Europe, Russia and whatnot, points beyond, although I didn't lose anyone in the war. So I had a largely sort of American point of view regarding the war and the Holocaust growing up. I had been to Eastern Europe a couple of times, backpacking when I was at Cambridge. When I worked at the Pentagon, we went to Slovakia. And so I did have a sort of a really immediate connection to that part of the world. But I had never lived there or studied it up close. And it was amazing to be on the ground for so long and have all of my preconceived notions of the place and the history just completely challenged.
I can just even imagine that. And I'm Jewish as well. And I've had this conversation a lot on my show about being a secular Jew in the United States, kind of a different circumstance than any European Jew, not just current European Jews, not just past ones. And I think when you come across that kind of thing, it has to have a profound effect, because you're really seeing something that your own people have gone through or are in the midst of going through. Must have been a sea change of feeling, even as a Jew, for yourself. Yes? No?
Yeah, when I was there, it was tremendously conflicted. So on one hand, it's such a rich and rewarding experience to live and practice as a Jew in defiance of all the Germans had tried to do there. But on the other hand, I was living in such proximity to the war that in order to get my car fixed at the mechanic, I would have to drive past the camp from Schindler's List. And so, you know how you may feel the first time you visit one of the gas chamber ruins, but I was going there, 50 and 60 times as part of my work. And so it really did have a profound effect on, my life and my psyche, I think, from those years.
And here's another thing, which is it's all World War II and what happened is so far removed, and yet it's not. It's just yesterday. I mean, in terms of history, it's difficult to believe that a Jewish community even remains in Europe. And Poland, which suffered the most in World War II, with the Auschwitz is there, the extermination camp. What did you find in the dealing with the Jewish community that you met while there? Why are they there?
Well, it's interesting. Before the war, there were about 3 million Jews in Poland, and after the war, about 300,000, and much immigration during the intervening decades. So I get there, and there's a few thousand Jewish people, and I would describe the mood when I was there in the 90s as what I would call last Jew out of Poland, turn out the lights. But an amazing thing has happened in the past 2 decades, and things have actually gotten better for people over there. There's been more financial support, particularly due to the return of Jewish property from a law that was passed in 1997. There's more support from the West. There's a new JCC in Krakow. You can follow it on Facebook, And so I don't ever think the Jewish community in Poland is going to be Brooklyn or, my community of Cherry Hill, but it is like a small community in the Deep South or Midwest that I really feel now is strong and enduring. And I give a lot of credit to the people who stayed. Most of them have a sister in Maryland and could have come here years ago, but they have stayed by choice, and I give them credit for that.
With the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, at that time when you were there, what was it like? Did you run across any anti-Semitism or people changed? I don't know. I can't imagine, but go ahead.
So I lived over in Poland with the Jewish star around my neck for 2.5 years, and I never had a problem. And, of course, I was a diplomat. The Jewish people over there, I know, live largely free of anti-Semitism, and far less so in Poland right now, ironically, than in places like France and Germany where, the synagogues are guarded and you're more worried about terrorism. Knock wood, Poland right now has been okay. It doesn't change, I think, the centuries of anti-Semitism before the war, nor the really awful things that happened there after the war. But I was amazed to meet many heroic Poles. There are, I believe, more Poles named as righteous Gentiles in Yad Vashem than other nationalities. And I really do believe that the key, regardless whether people agree on, Poland and anti-Semitism in the past, I think the key is all about engaging the younger generation in a dialogue, because there are just people there that are so curious to learn and engage.
Yeah, fascinating. This change of heart and mind because of what you saw and lived, being so close to the proximity of such horrors. I think to myself, the blood of Jews in Poland is drenched over the landscape. And it's just a permanent reminder of the atrocities the Jews suffered at the hands of the Nazis and the betrayal of their own countrymen. All of these themes start to wind up in books of yours. It's phenomenal. I love it. It's just washed over you. To tell the story as a novelist and do it successfully, what's the key? What turned inside of you? What are you reaching for when you start to write your books?
Well, just a bit of background. So I was one of those kids long before my years in Poland who had always wanted to be a novelist. And I never quite got started all through the years in Europe and school when I had enough time. And many people may have that kind of project that you just never get going. So I came back from Poland, and instead of continuing with the State Department, I actually went to law school. I graduated law school and became a practicing attorney exactly 1 week before 9/11 happened. And for me, I had a life epiphany that I refer to as, "Dear God, I don't want to die at the law firm." And what I mean by that is being a lawyer was a fine and admirable thing, but I had this dream of being a novelist that had never quite gotten started, and had I been a 9/11 victim, I never would have realized my dream. So I got started writing my novels kind of as an outgrowth of that epiphany. And of course, my novels have just been so inspired by what I had seen in Poland and true bits of history in every one of them. And when we talk about my years over there, the thing that I think carries over through all my novels from my experiences with the State Department and in Europe is really the gray areas in people. So my own notions of people and places were so profoundly challenged by my experiences, and I like to reflect that in my work. So in my books, the Jewish characters are flawed, the Nazis are human, and the Poles are everywhere in between. And I take a lot of flack for that, from my readers, but it's something I believe in very strongly.
I'm glad that you said that. I just had a conversation about just that thing with another writer recently on the show, saying that we tend to we have these ideas of what Nazis are, and so Achtun has to be in every sentence and the Jews have to be perfect. And that's just not true. I mean, it's just not true. And your books are so real. I think that's why they hit home so hard, because the characters are so dimensional and not caricatures. I have to applaud you for that. I have to ask you a question. What kind of law are you practice? I couldn't find that out.
I was a labor and employment attorney at a firm and in-house, and now I teach law school. So, there is actually a nice synergy between sort of legal writing and fiction writing, and I explore that with my students, and it helps my work also, I think.
Okay, that's interesting to me. So talk to me about that. You're smart as a whip, highly educated, very emotional, clearly, in your opinions and your thoughts and your feelings. Why write fiction, historical fiction, and not go into writing facts and true history? Talk to me about that.
It's interesting because I have a master's degree in history from Cambridge, and clearly I think there could arguably be a real historical book in me, but I've just been so consumed with the novel writing, and it's always been in me even as a child. It was never short stories, it was never poems, it was always going to be novels. And I think that right now, especially, we see a whole lot of novels coming out of this era, the World War II novels that are so popular with readers and writers these days. And for me, it really boils down to that I love to take a reader and I love to put the reader in the shoes of my protagonist and have the reader say, what would I have done? And that really dates back to my time in Poland, where you'd hear one of those old world sirens, and kind of just want to go hide in your basement. It was really that real and in front of you. And so I like to take my reader and say, what would I have done in these circumstances? And the war, with the stark choices and dire circumstances, really just is such fertile ground for storytelling.
There's no question about that. You mentioned something I do want to talk to you about. When we talked the last time you were on my show, you appeared with many divine wonderful ladies, friends of mine, collaborators in the wonderful collection of short stories, Grand Central, original stories of post-war love and reunion. I asked you a question. I think there were 6 of you on the show that day, and so each of you got like 2 minutes. So all answers were quick. But I want to go back to something that I did ask you, which is World War II, the Nazis, death camps, frightening, discouraging time in history, and yet writers go there, and so do readers. Such an odd canvas on which to paint this horror. What's the attraction? What's going on here? Why this resurgence? Why do you think?
Well, it's interesting. A couple of reasons. When I was over in Europe right after communism ended, all of these archival materials that were never available to us in the intervening decades suddenly became available. And I think there's just more research material and stories and archives that are so rich with information. And secondly, the generation of survivors is getting up there in years. And there's a real impetus to capture and tell stories, whether in the form of memoir or fiction, while we can right now. That said, there's a huge amount of responsibility with this. So it's interesting. My books have never really gone into the camps, and they're all over the war, but I don't spend a lot of time actually in the camps. I'm not quite sure why. But I do remember as I was writing my first book, The Commandant's Girl, I watched Band of Brothers, which is the finest thing ever put on film, and they showed them liberating one of the camps. And I had this tremendous sense of inadequacy. Who was I to be writing this book with scenes, at the opera or the symphony or dinner parties 60 miles from Auschwitz? Who was I to be writing this? And the answer came to me, because those things really were going on 60 miles from Auschwitz. And so, I consider it just an obligation and, a responsibility to show all facets of life during the war. Well,
I think that's certainly fair to say. And it was clearly that, who you were dependent upon what that life was, for sure, during World War II. I'm also curious why you think the readers go there. I'm one of your readers. I mean, and I'm asking myself all the time, why am I reading this? And we're going to get to the new book, The Winter's Guest, in a minute. But I found you through The Commandant's Girl. I'm saying to myself, why am I so fascinated by this? And yet I can't put it down. You have any clue?
It's a great question. I read a ton of material set in this era also. The other Grand Central authors you've mentioned, I read their books constantly, and it's the immediacy of the history. It's so recent in time and yet so completely foreign to our lives here. And with each bit, people like to experience it and empathize with it and also learn from it. So, for example, when I was writing Commandant's Girl, I ran into, happenstance on a train, a Holocaust survivor, man and wife, very well known. And when I said I was writing a book set in Krakow during the war, they said to me, surely you know the story of the Krakow Jewish resistance. And I was amazed. I had lived years in Krakow and had never heard of a Jewish resistance there. So I went back and researched it, and there was this untold story of heroism and uprising on the very streets where I had lived and worked. And that became the true underpinning for Commandant's Girl, for that particular book. So for readers, I think it's an ability to glimpse and grasp a moment in time.
Yeah. And an oddly simpler time at the same time that is so fraught with peril. It's a moment in history. I don't know that we'll ever have anything quite like that again. Hopefully not. But you know what I'm saying. It's dynamic in so many different ways. Such an odd thing. This crossed my mind. This is my crazy mind. Is there an extra special joy in the fact that your breakout book was The Commandant's Girl, which tells the story of the Jewish resistance in Poland and Krakow? As a person, as a Jew, as anything, isn't that just, do you ever think about that? My God, look at this. I brought this thing to the world. The story that may never have been told.
I mean, I was, I was so gratified by the response to Commandant's Girl. And even now, because it was I think Commandant's Girl was really on the forefront of this wave of sort of World War II novels, because it was 7 years ago and all these books that have come since. So I'm very grateful for the reception of the book and kind of the ability to join in this conversation. I regard my books as love songs to Jewish Europe, starting with Commandant's Girl and coming right up to The Winter's winter guest. And so if people take it with that sort of respect, and they're happy with how I've treated it, that's most important to me.
I want to talk to you about this latest book, The Winter's Guest. As I said in the intro, it's the story of twin sisters fighting for survival in Nazi-occupied Poland in 1940, struggling to raise their younger siblings when one finds a downed American paratrooper in the woods. Let me begin by telling you this. It's tough to make Halli cry. I cried.
Oh.
I don't cry. I cried. This is really quite some story of these twins. Where did this concept come from, this story?
The winter guest really comes from two different places. The first actually predates my years at the State Department. Before I went there, I spent a year at the Pentagon as a special assistant to the Secretary of the Army. And I refer to that as my year where I saw the world from the shoulders of giants, to paraphrase Sir Isaac Newton. It was the 50th anniversary of World War II, and I was privileged to travel with my boss all over the world. We traveled to Corregidor in the Philippines and Bastogne in Belgium, and we traveled to a tiny little cabin in the Slovak mountains where a young Slovak girl had aided the paratroopers and the partisans. And her story has stayed with me for 20 years and is the story that I fictionalized in the Winter Guest. The other true bit of history that inspired The Winter Guest has to do with what I call the bones. So if you open The Winter Guest, you'll see that the prologue is set in modern-day New York, where an elderly woman is approached by a rabbi and a policeman who say, bones have been found at a development site in Poland, and we think you know something about them. And the story then scrolls back to show where the bones came from during the war. This was inspired by my work with the State Department in Poland, where many times bones have been found either because Germans killed someone in an unmarked location or because a cemetery was plowed under, outright. And so when these bones are found, it raises important questions of whose bones and what is to be done with the site. So I wanted to explore that kind of as the framework for The Winter Guest.
And that you do well. At the heart of the story are these two sisters, twins. There's a great deal of jealousy between the two of them. You have a little knowledge about twins, my friend, huh?
Yes, I do. I have twin girls who are 4, not 18 as Helena and Ruth are in the book. My twins are 4. And so the issues with the younger twins are very different. But I think some of what I've experienced as a mom of twins comes across in the book. For example, when Helena looks back on her childhood and she reflects that there were never enough hands to go around for everyone, that perhaps reflects some of my own anxiety as having had not just 2, but in fact 3 small children at the same time. Now, I can't actually remember if I conceived of my twins or the Winter Guest twins first. It's all a bit of a blur. But I wrote an earlier book called The Things We Cherished, in which I explored relationships between several sets of brothers. And so I was eager to turn to this relationship between sisters in The Winter Guest. And
I love the thing. And I also love the American pilot, Sam, who happens to be Jewish. And I loved it because it's an oddity that people don't realize how many Jewish servicemen, young men served in the war. My dad being one. I think you have some relationship to that as well.
I do have a grandfather who was in both the European and, Asian theaters of the war, Pacific theaters, yes.
So talk to me about Sam. Oh, wonderful Sam.
Well, I just thought it was interesting because obviously his choice to come, because this is at a point where at this point in the story, the Americans aren't even formally in the war. This is all early in World War II, where the work he's doing there is of a more covert nature. And so the choice, and at that point it was a choice to go, and the additional danger that he would be placed in was something that I wanted to explore in the book. In addition, what he brings to Helena's life, because she's never really had exposure to Jewish people before.
Yeah, I there are some twists and turns in this as well, which I don't want to go into because I really do want everybody to pick this book up. It's so wonderful. Your grandmother, you call her Bubbly Fega. Right? Is it Faggy?
Yes, that's good memory.
Well, I read I'm one of your fans. I read your books and I read them from cover to cover. Her story is so interesting, and it wound up, I guess, the core of your short story in the Grand Central. Does she make, without giving too much of your story away for the Winter's Guest, does she make an appearance of sorts in this book as well?
That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought that she did. So, for folks who aren't familiar with, my grandmother's story was the basis of my story in the Grand Central anthology, which focused on. It was about a young woman, and sort of my grandmother who had grown up in China, which my grandmother did, in the Jewish communities of Shanghai and Harbin, and made a courageous journey to America as a young girl to find her father, only to find that things were not at all what they seemed. She doesn't show up exactly in the book, but one thing I've really come to appreciate from talking to my readers is my books are about strong women. And I don't mean strong women in our 2014 sense of the word, where, we're all career empowered and this and that. But if you think back in your own family, everybody's got that grandmother or that aunt who, despite the traditional roles women were limited to, was really kind of the strength of the family and just did amazing things, either overtly or behind the scenes. And my grandmother, Faye, who traveled to America from China by herself as a young woman, really embodies that spirit. And so do the twins in The Winter Guest, Helena and Ruth.
Well, I like I said, I don't want to give the story away, but that opening character who appears again at the end, the wisdom of her life and how she wound up. I thought of your grandmother. I don't know why.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because I did picture my grandmother's apartment in a senior center when I was writing this.
Well, there you go.
You have picked up on it even more sort of subconsciously than I had realized.
Well, there you go, right? Because we're all collective. It's a collective consciousness of sorts. As a writer of historical fiction, I don't think there's anyone more qualified to understand that we are, as much as anything, our history, and as Jews as much as any, our collective history. Do you find solace in that? Is that part of the joy of taking these stories and bringing them and the characters and the history to life? You're creating a collective consciousness for all of us to go back to understand. Do you think about that?
It is, and perhaps in a part of the world, I don't know that it's as conscious on my part. I'm storytelling, but when I look back, and when I lived in Poland and I would walk the streets, and the first times I visited Eastern Europe, I had this instant sense of Yiddishkeit, of Jewishness there. Yeah. And as I heard a rabbi describe it once, when someone asked him why he kept going back to that part of the world, he said, because our ancestors were here for 800 years, it is our patrimony. And so I do have that sense that I carry that time and people and part of the world with me, that I did not simply leave after my years there, but that a big chunk of my heart is there. And were I not, wings clipped with 3 small children, I would be on a plane back to visit immediately. So for me, telling the stories is a way of keeping that piece alive, I guess.
So what's next, my friend?
Well, I'm changing direction slightly. I'm still staying with the war, but I have a book coming out next summer, and it's called The Last Summer at Chelsea Beach. And it is the story, it's set on the home front, which is a departure for me. It's the story of a young Italian Jewish immigrant girl. She comes here by herself as she's turning 16, and she finds herself in Atlantic City and Philadelphia, very close to a large Irish family with 4 sons, right, as the war breaks out. So it's very much about what that does to her life, and it takes her back to war-torn London as well as the United States. So still the war, just a different facet of it.
Look for it, folks. Hey, Pam?
Yes.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I've been speaking with Pam Jenoff, author of The Winter Guest, by way of Mira. There is a free novella that goes along with The Winter Guest called The Other Girl. You can download it from wherever you download books. For further information on Pam Jenoff and her work, be sure to visit her website at pamjenoff.com. The year is 1941, and much of Europe has fallen to Adolf Hitler. A distressed Winston Churchill is doing everything he can to beat back the Nazis. But with hundreds of soldiers being killed and warships being sunk every day, time is running out. Implored to help, a conflicted President Franklin Delano Roosevelt dispatches his personal emissary, Harry Hopkins, to assess the escalating situation in London. And thus begins an epic journey back to World War II in the new, factually based historical novel, Sleep in Peace Tonight, by its author, James MacManus. A little bit about Mr. MacManus. He was born in London in 1943 educated at Westminster School, and graduated from St. Andrews University in 1966. As he tells his story, he broke his Guardian-reading parents' hearts when he joined the Daily Express. He redeemed himself when he moved to the Guardian in 1972, working first as a reporter in the London office and then as a foreign correspondent. He moved over to the Times in November 1992, eventually becoming managing editor in 1996, and ultimately taking on the role of managing director of the prestigious Times Literary Supplement, a title he still holds today. He's the author of Ocean Devil, made into a film starring Jonathan Rhys Meyers. His previous novels include The Language of the Sea and Black Venus, hailed by critics. Sleep in Peace Tonight is MacManus's third novel. So here you go again. Another delicious read, Mr. MacManus. Sleep in Peace Tonight. Another historical novel based on history. Tell me who Harry Hopkins was and why you wanted to write about him. And let me make this point clear to you. I love the fact that a Brit wrote about the American Harry Hopkins' interesting but not well-known story.
No, Harry Hopkins has largely been forgotten by history. In fact, my tutor at St. Andrews University, an American from Texas actually, who first introduced me to him, told me that Harry Hopkins had dropped through what he called a trapdoor in history. And I regard Hopkins as a forgotten hero of the Second World War, an American who did a huge amount to create the relationship between Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt, a relationship which became a war-winning alliance for us on these islands and for you in America. And nobody now really has any idea of how that happened. So yes, a forgotten hero in my view.
Writing history is fiction. You were a reporter, and apparently you're an artist as well. I mean, you're a writer. That makes you an artist. Is that it? Writing truth as fiction allows you to use both muscles? Is that what the attraction is to doing fiction history as fiction?
No, I think I've always been something of an amateur historian and a believer that the novel can convey wider truths. Historical novels can be very, very important in introducing people who would not normally read about history to the past. I mean, take some great American novels about for instance, the American Civil War. Those introduce people to a period in American history that is not really open to them otherwise. And that's why I like historical fiction.
London, 1941, the Blitz, the Nazis, and such a frightening, discouraging time in history, and yet writers go there, and so do readers. This is seemingly odd canvas on which to paint, in my opinion. And why do you think the attraction that we keep going back there through fiction?
It was an astonishing time of history. And in many ways, it was a very simple time. It was a black and white time. We knew who the enemy was. The enemy knew us. There were no grays in that period. The Nazis and the fascists were occupying Europe, and the Americans and the British, with their allies around the world, had to displace them. So I think people have a sort of nostalgia for that age in which there was no ambiguity about it, was there? We had to fight to win, or we were going to lose our civilization. That was what was at stake. There's
also an odd romanticism associated with World War II, despite its horror. Is that in that what you were talking about the nostalgia?
Well, I think so, because London during the Blitz was an extraordinary place, and London at that time is almost a character in this book. You have to remember that for most people between May 1940 and September 1940 and May 1941, they did not know whether they would have a tomorrow, particularly in our big industrial cities like London. And for 40,000 people in London, there was no tomorrow. They died in the Blitz under the bombs. Therefore, people lived a life very much on the edge. And under the blackout, relationships, casual flings, love affairs flourished, as you might expect. And that brought about a huge social change in our country. The old class system crumbled, the old social mores crumbled, and people realized that cheap alcohol and a quick love affair were one way of dealing with the dangers of imminent death. So it was in many ways a dangerous but very romantic period.
Wish you were there?
Well, I wasn't born long after it, I have to say. I'm that old. I was born in 1943. No, I don't wish I was there. I think it was highly dangerous. My parents were there. My father was in the Navy, and my mother was bringing up children under the bombs. So she knew all about it.
So What attracted you to this particular story? Was it the gigantic heroes who came together in this odd moment in time, Churchill and Roosevelt and your character, Harry Hopkins? Edward R. Murrow makes an appearance, by the way, in this terrific book, and so does actor Jimmy Stewart. Do they even make men like those guys today?
Well, I don't know about that. That would be a very difficult judgment to make. But as I said, I was introduced to Harry Hopkins by my American tutor at university, St Andrews University in Scotland. And since those days, I've always been interested in his story and tried to work out why he'd been so forgotten. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that this Midwesterner from Iowa, a sort of small-town kid with a college degree, but no kind of big family background like the Roosevelts and the Churchills, he managed to create a relationship between those two, as I've said, and get on terms with people like Joseph Stalin. That was an amazing achievement. I mean, these were men with huge egos. These were men with bruisingly different ideas about how the war should be conducted, who argued with each other endlessly. And Hopkins had to mediate in the middle and keep that transatlantic relationship on the road. And he did so in such a way that he drew huge praise from Winston Churchill. I mean, Churchill described him at one time as, let me just get this right because it's an important quote if I can find it, an extraordinary man, he called him, who was to play a decisive role in the whole movement of the war. Now that's pretty high praise from the British Prime Minister to an American envoy, which is what he was.
It makes me wonder, where are the Harry Hopkins of the world today, particularly in my country where politics is now truly a blood sport and there are none of these people in between bridging these gaps. So, which is a reason why I think your story is so important right now and one that everybody should be reading. How did you research this book? Where did you go to uncover the facts? And let me make the point, I think it's pretty ridiculously funny, in my American sense of humor, that a Brit is writing about this forgotten American hero. Where are the American writers? My goodness.
Well, no, there have been books on Harry Hopkins. Let's be clear about that. And some quite good ones recently. David Rohl has written a good biography of Harry Hopkins. But I think the answer to your question is this, or one of the answers is, Harry Hopkins and Franklin Roosevelt died before they could produce their memoirs, before they could give their account of history. And that's one reason why Hopkins has sort of dropped out of view. The other is, and one should accept this, Hopkins was a deeply divisive and unpopular character in Washington. The Republicans loathed him because of his activities during the New Deal years when he implemented many very radical policies. And the Democrats distrusted him because he had this extraordinary access to the president. I mean, Hopkins lived in the White House. He was unelected. Yet he was probably more important to Roosevelt than any member of his cabinet. Now, that's inevitably going to make somebody very unpopular, and Hopkins was very unpopular. Thus, after his death in 1946, there were very few people to speak up for Harry Hopkins, including, of course, Harry Hopkins himself, who never wrote a memoir.
Yeah, an interesting character for sure. I just ran into him again in another work of fiction. I was rereading Herman Wouk's The Winds of War.
Oh, yes.
And he actually does Harry Hopkins, which is how I had heard of him via fiction. There you go. I love the cover of this book, by the way, and the title, Sleep in Peace Tonight. How'd you get that title? How'd you get there?
Well, this is a novel, of course, although it's grounded in history. And in my novel, it is fair to say that Winston Churchill was very, very anxious to find out what Harry Hopkins was sending back to the White House. Roosevelt wanted to know the truth. Could Britain survive in January 1941? And Churchill did give Harry Hopkins a very attractive young driver who was to drive him around the country. I've turned that driver into a character, Leonora Finch. I've created a relationship between the two of them. Now, I have no idea whether Harry Hopkins had a relationship with anybody in London during the Blitz. He had an eye for the ladies. He liked to drink. He liked a good time. And there was, as I've said, a good time to be had in London in the Blitz months. So when he leaves to return to Washington at the end of February, Leonora Finch, who's the name of the driver, the name I've given to the driver, writes him a small poem to remind him that when he's back in Washington, they still in London are under the bombs of the Nazis. And the poem she wrote him was this: Sleep in peace tonight. Remember we who fight, the fiery death that falls from London's dazzled skies. And she wrote it and sent it to him anonymously, because when he got it in the White House, he knew exactly who had sent it.
She reminded me a little bit, I don't know if you thought on this, but Kay Summersby.
Well, that's a very interesting parallel, because Kay Summersby, of course, was very close to Eisenhower. Quite what their relationship it was, we are not clear, but he did adore her. He spent most of his time with her, and vice versa, in the North African campaigns and in the run-up to D-Day. And he actually made her a captain in the U.S. Army and gave her American citizenship, which is not something you do to your driver. So
she did write a book, didn't she? As I recall, I remember picking.
She wrote two books.
Yeah.
She wrote one book after the war in 1948, which was Eisenhower Was My Boss, which was a very straightforward account of her time with Eisenhower, which did make it clear, I have to say, that they had a pretty close professional relationship.
Right.
And then as she was dying in 1974, she wrote a second book called Past Forgetting, in which she claimed to reveal the truth about their affair and said that they were in love and that there was a physical side to their affair and that Eisenhower had actually wanted to marry her, but had been persuaded not to do so. So I didn't exactly model Leonora Finch on Kay, but there were grounds for thinking that Hopkins may have had some relationship in London, at least.
Fascinating. As much as anything, this book is clearly about relationships. I mean, relationships between a whole host of characters. Let's go to Churchill. This man is just, oh my God. I just love to talk about Winston Churchill. First of all, let's talk about the bathtub and him and Trust and Hopkins. What are your thoughts? Well, first of all, tell everybody that bathroom scene and the bathtub scene. And is any of that true? And what bridged the gap between these two men that they were able to get to some level of trust?
Very good question. Firstly, the bathtub story is absolutely true. And it wasn't just Hopkins who found himself ushered into Winston Churchill's bathroom, I should say, when the Prime Minister was in his bath, splashing away with lots of soap and sponges, and was asked to sit down. And Hopkins, to his amazement, had this meeting with the Prime Minister in the bathroom. And it is absolutely true that when Hopkins relayed this information to Franklin Roosevelt in the White House, never had there been greater laughter in the Oval Office than when Roosevelt told his assembled cabinet about the story. Now, the point about Churchill is that he was leading a campaign against the fascist forces. There was not a minute of the day he wished to lose. He got up early, he drank and lived late at night, and he had meetings in his bathroom with visitors such as Harry Hopkins. He saw nothing wrong with that. I may say the visitors were all men, not women. And Hopkins relayed this story he had several meetings with Churchill in the bath. So that is absolutely true. Now, to come to your key question, how was trust created between these two men? Well, Hopkins, as Churchill knew, was a man of the left. He came out of the Midwest. He distrusted anything to do with the British Empire, didn't like the idea of Winston Churchill, who was, of course, a great proponent of empire, but very much saw the need to fight fascism. That is why President Roosevelt sent him to London, because the isolationists could not accuse Roosevelt of sending someone who was going to be a cat's paw, so to speak, a mere spokesman for the British Prime Minister. Churchill knew that he had to win and to woo this man. He knew that Hopkins was going to be the conduit for him to the White House. And Churchill had, as we know, huge charm, huge oratorical skills, an immense capacity to stay up late at night, drinking endless glasses of brandy, mesmerizing his guests, his visitors, with his language. And that's exactly what he did. And Hopkins, very early on in their relationship, simply wrote to President Roosevelt these words, "Christ," he said, "what a man." And I think that pretty much sums it up.
And it is, you have to put this all in the context too, I suspect, because not everybody understands where this was. I mean, you guys were fighting alone in this battle against the fascists, and, you know, there were a lot of people who didn't want America to get involved. amongst them our ambassador Joe Kennedy, who was a sympathizer with the Nazis for sure. Charles Lindbergh, our great hero, was another one, anti-Semitic and just didn't want anything to do with it. So Hopkins really does become something quite critical in going back to Roosevelt and making his recommendations and telling him what he had learned. And I wanted to make that point across to the listeners who may not know all of that history and how the United States wasn't rushing into war, correct?
It certainly wasn't rushing into war. In fact, there were huge pressures on President Roosevelt from the isolationist movement and from the opinion polls to stay well out of the conflict. The opinion polls are running about 80% against any involvement in Europe, let alone giving any aid to Britain. At the same time, the Lend-Lease legislation was going very slowly through Congress, being fought at every stage in the committee by the isolationists. And the isolationists were led by some very powerful men, not least Henry Ford, the big industrialist. So they had clout in Washington. And the public opinion polls really gave President Roosevelt reason to be extremely cautious, and he was. So when Harry Hopkins got back to Washington, he did his best to help the president, to bolster him in his battle to get Lend-Lease through. And on March the 6th, 1941, the vote was passed and Lend-Lease was agreed, and the first supplies began to flow towards Britain, much needed, I may say.
Right, and Lend-Lease is another thing that I think a lot of people don't understand what that was. Rather than getting directly involved in the war, they were very clever about how they figured that they were going to help Britain at least against the fascists and lend, if you will, supplies and with the option that you guys were going to have to give them back at the end of the war. I mean, that was the first kind of...
That was the plan, yeah.
Right, that was the plan. I wanted to make that clear. Churchill is such an amazing character, as I say. Loved. You hear all sorts of things about this man. Reviled. An alcoholic, perhaps? Talk to me.
He was certainly what we would regard now, what modern doctors regard as an alcoholic. But Churchill, it should be understood, always liked to have a glass of something alcoholic to hand, be it wine, be it spirits, or champagne. Champagne was his favorite drink. He didn't necessarily consume large quantities. He sipped, and throughout the evening he would sip a glass of champagne or a glass of wine. And that is what enabled him to keep going until 2 or 3 in the morning. That and the fact that always, every afternoon after lunch, Churchill had a nap. And that was essential to the way that he managed to keep going for those long, long hours. But Harry Hopkins said in his messages back to, coded messages to the White House, he could not believe the amount of alcohol that Churchill and those around him drank. And he began to come to the conclusion that alcohol was a sort of weapon in the British war armory.
Why not, right? You take what you can get to get yourself through those days. People drank a lot more in those days than they do today, too, I think. I mean, I think you have to put that into its context as well. Going in, I don't know, you're a Brit. He was your prime minister. Did you have one concept of Churchill going in and after the research come up with something different, or what? No, I think we are schooled heavily in this country to realize what Churchill did for us in that critical year of 1940-41, those years. And had he not become prime minister, had he not stood and maneuvered himself into that position, I would be talking to you in German now. Oh, jeez. That's true. I believe it. I believe that. I want to digress for a second. You're the managing director of the Times Literary Supplement. I got you here. I want to talk to you. I want to talk to you about what you think is going on in the book business for a moment and ask you in terms of digitalizing books and Amazon.com and what it's doing to the business. And let me throw out this curve to you as well. I'm wondering if you're worried at all to the quality of material being published in this culture crazy world that we're in. Right. Well, as far as the digital sort of age and book publishing goes, yes, there are huge worries. It's the same thing facing newspapers. But I think publishers are becoming quite clever at managing that. They're getting digital versions out fast. Typically, a publisher will publish the hardback version, then it goes on to Kindle, then there's an ebook version, and then it'll go into paperback. There are still huge sales of paperbacks in the major countries such as, Britain, America, and France. And if you put that product alongside the ebook and the Kindle, you've got a sort of balance. Now, obviously, on digital editions, the receipts for the publisher are much lower.
they're getting much less per copy, but they do get much higher volume. And I think the big future for publishers, providing they make sure that the content, the books, what they're publishing, actually meets audiences' expectations for high quality fiction and, of course, non-fiction.
Okay, there was your answer. You dedicate your book to Nicholas Strong MacManus, who you say in the dedication died from leukemia in his final year at Oxford at age 21, your son.
No, my brother.
Your brother. I wasn't sure, and I wanted to ask you about this because I think that we're the sum of all the things that happened to us in our life. You also changed your career. You had a severe heart attack. Did I read that? At one point. All of that. You're such a good writer. You get into the core of who people are in your books. I never expect a Brit to have the emotions that you're able to convey in your stories. I don't know why. But are you the sum of all of that? Is that you take all those things that happen and somehow they zoom out in the work?
Well, yes. Thank you for all that. If I can just say this, I write very much for the reader. I do not write for my peer group. I do not write for my friends. I do not write for book reviews. I have the reader very much in mind. And I think the modern reader in this sort of media, kind of fast media age, wants fiction that has a strong narrative drive, that has really credible characters, between whom emotions flow. And I think the great thing is to make them do so credibly. Those people do fall in love. They do fall in lust. They do hate each other. These emotions must be powerfully expressed. But above all, the narrative must continue, I think, at a page-turning pace. And that's what I try and do.
And do it well. So when you're not writing, what are you doing?
I do a lot of reading.
Sounds like it. Historical fiction, I assume, or history?
No, not necessarily. By the way, the book whose title I was searching for earlier on, the book I admire so much, is Gone with the Wind, of course.
Oh, well.
Now, that is a history novel or historical novel.
One of the best.
Introduced millions. It's sold, I think, 40 million copies so far. Millions of Americans to what actually happened in the Civil War and in the Reconstruction that followed. Far more than any history books, well, not so far more, but I mean far better read, more widely read, than a history of the period. And that's why I think that historical novels are so powerful.
Point well taken. In this country, of course, there's a lot of ambivalence about that book. Everybody loves it. Everybody reads it. Everybody enjoys it. And there aren't any characters, I don't think to date, have been met up to the two in that book. But, they all say it's been glorified slavery, blah, 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 blah. So it's an interesting title in this country.
Oh, it's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Anything you chose not to use in Sleep in Peace tonight?
No, that's a question I'm often asked. And the answer is no, because there was so much that came out of the research that was rich in terms of interpretation of characters and plot, that I put all of it in, basically. And there was nothing I left out for reasons, certainly, of sensitivity. Nothing about Hopkins or Churchill or FDR. I mean, we haven't talked much about Roosevelt in this interview, but he was an extraordinary man to whom we owe a huge amount, and who had to move with crab-like caution given the politics in which he was operating there. So I hope they're all recognized to some extent as heroes, but certainly Hopkins is one we deserve to recognize as a hero.
I was going to bring Roosevelt up, actually, at this point, because I want to ask you about Roosevelt from a British point of view. Just the same way you have you were raised on Churchill, and in your country you're schooled in Churchill. Here we're raised on Roosevelt. I'm curious as to, from your point of view, looking over at us at Roosevelt, what are your thoughts?
I think most people in Britain have huge admiration for him. We understand that after the Second World War, Roosevelt was heavily criticized, as indeed was Harry Hopkins, for being far too generous to the Soviets by way of information and equipment and supplies. And Roosevelt's generally thought to be, in America anyway, very soft on Stalin. Well, that's an easy judgment to make in hindsight. But we should remember that Stalin was a key ally of ours in the fight against Hitler. And the German military forces, even as late as 1944, after D-Day, were very, very strong. And without the Russians on the Eastern Front, we would have lost, so many more, hundreds of thousands of young men. So I completely understand why Roosevelt supported Stalin in that way. I can equally understand after the Cold War began, and the whole argument about who gave the Russians the secrets of the A-bomb and so on and so forth, that people tended to look back on Roosevelt with slightly different views.
Yeah, he's caught up in a lot of things in the dialogue of this country. Did he not save the Jews soon enough?
Exactly.
So he here mostly loved, I think, and somewhat confused because of some of the things that he didn't do in time. So who do you think it was who saved your British arses? Was it Roosevelt? Was it Harry Hopkins? Who do you think was really in control here?
It was both, wasn't it? I mean, it was essentially Roosevelt. America came into the war, of course, after Pearl Harbor. But one should remember that before that, Roosevelt, both through Lend-Lease and through a number of other initiatives, such as he began to offer escorts for our merchant ships in the North Atlantic up to a certain line. He certainly helped us with tactical information and began to get food supplies. I mean, Britain in 1941 was a nation starving. We had 30 million people. We did not have enough food. We had absolutely no money. We were broke. And without Roosevelt and the United States of America, as I said, I would be talking to you now in German.
Achtung. I have no idea what you knew at the time, of the time and the players going into writing and researching Sleep in Peace Tonight. But I wonder, after all your research and then your writing, what insight you gained into the kind of people we were in those perilous times. I mean, we've said it, such extraordinary opposites in humanity, Hitler versus Churchill, or Harry Hopkins versus Churchill, and Franklin Roosevelt. Your thoughts, what did you want your readers to take away with them from reading Sleep in Peace Tonight? And I guess those are two separate questions, but have at it.
Okay. Well, let me answer the last question first. I hope they take away, one, a real view about Harry Hopkins as an American who is not given his historical view. His historical due. I hope also they take away an idea of what life was like in Britain and in the White House. Let's not forget this. In those very fraught months of 1941. If people have a slightly better understanding of what we in London went through during the Blitz and of the kind of tortuous politics which Roosevelt managed to master in Washington in those months, I think I will have achieved something in this book. But above all, I just hope that Harry Hopkins comes out as what I regard him to be, a real forgotten American hero.
I've been speaking to James MacManus, author of Sleep in Peace Tonight by way of Thomas Dunn Books, an imprint of St. Martin's Press, a wonderful new historical novel which takes readers on an epic journey back to World War II. For more information on the author and his many books, visit his website at jamesmacmanus.com. Before I go, I want to remind everyone that podcasts of current and past shows are always available to listen to free on iTunes under the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is also available for download via Spreaker.com, Stitcher.com, BlogTalkRadio.com, and a host of other venues. Google the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, and you will find us. Of course, podcasts of our shows, both past and present, are always posted for your listening pleasure at HalliCasser-Jayne.com, which I hope you'll visit often for the latest information on our upcoming segments. Oh, and while you're at HalliCasser-Jayne.com, don't forget to visit my blog to read my latest musings. I'll be back next week, same time, 3 p.m. Eastern, for another edition of the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, Talk Radio for Fine Minds, brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download at www.audibletrial.com/The Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Audible.com features over 100,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Stay in touch, won't you? Remember, that's HalliCasser-Jayne.com. Discover us on Facebook at Halli Casser-Jayne and on Twitter at HalliCJ. I love to hear from you. So, till we meet again, this is Halli Casser-Jayne. It's a wrap.